Most cheese made today is made in huge factories with large vats of milk and curds and pump out cheeses by the hundreds, if not thousands per day. But for most of the history of cheese making, cheese has been made on a much smaller scale, usually with individual families or farms producing small batches of cheese to sell locally. So when did this change? When did cheese making go industrial? Hey there, cheese historians! I'm Julia and welcome to Cheese History, a channel all about the origins, history and impact of cheese. The vast majority of cheese available in supermarkets is made in some sort of factory. This is because making anything in large quantities is more efficient in terms of both time and costs. But cheese has only been made at an industrial scale for the last century or so. Before that, it was made on the farms themselves. In this video, I'm going to be looking at how and where we made the shift from small local cheese making to large industrial scale factory cheese making. I'm going to look at 3 different stages in the development of industrial cheese factories. The development that enabled cheese factories to be possible, the earliest cheese factories that started the process, and the movement towards full-on industrialization of cheese making in these factories. With cheese typically being made on farms for most of the history of cheesemaking, the first step towards industrialization took place on these farms. The 17th century set the scene for the industrialization of cheesemaking. In both England and the Netherlands, cheesemaking was going through a boom, and the cheesemakers were looking for ways to get their cheese to more people. This led to many changes to how cheeses were made, including developing methods to help the cheeses last longer and to be easily transported long distances. This resulted in some of the cheeses that we're familiar with today, like Gouda and Cheddar. At the beginning of the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing, and new equipment was being produced that helped the farm cheesemakers, usually dairy women, to produce greater quantities of cheese. Dairy herds grew as a result, and separate cheese houses were built on farms to make cheese. There were also cases as early as the 1690s where farmers would sell their milk to another farm which had a cheese dairy rather than making the cheese themselves. Advances in scientific understanding began having an impact on cheesemaking in the mid-19th century, as many scientists and cheesemakers, particularly in England, began looking into what was actually happening during cheesemaking. Cheesemaking is still both an art and a science, but until the scientists started looking into what was happening, it was definitely an art. It could take someone years to develop the instincts and intuition to make really good, consistent cheese. By uncovering what was happening, doing deliberate experiments, and recording the results, these scientists helped to take much of the guesswork out of making cheese. It became easier to make cheese with consistent characteristics, such as flavour and texture, without having to spend years learning the art. They published their findings in journals so others could access the information and improve the cheesemaking practices on their own farms. They even helped educate the cheesemakers in these new practices. One of the leading figures in this movement to understand cheesemaking was Joseph Harding, sometimes known as the father of cheddar. Harding settled into dairy farming and cheddar making in 1851 at Vale Court Farm, which was slightly north of the traditional cheddar making region of the time. Since his farm was considered an undesirable region for making cheddar, Harding set out to learn as much as possible about the cheddar making process, both by experimenting with variations in procedure and by consulting the best practices of other cheesemakers. Noticing the improvement in his own cheese, Harding spread the word to others in an article published in 1860 in the Journal of the Royal Agricultural Society of England about his method for making cheddar. In that article, Harding detailed his first innovation, scalding the cheddar curd before milling in order to produce a finer texture of cheese. I'll come back to Harding a bit later, but the processes he developed will be vital for the improvement of industrial cheesemaking. These improvements in both the equipment and techniques for cheesemaking set the scene for the first cheese factories. All these developments paved the way for the move to small-scale cooperatives, where farmers from several farms supplied their milk to a factory that was built to handle larger-scale cheesemaking. There was one such factory in Switzerland in 1815, but it didn't last very long before closing down. A more enduring cheese factory dates to 1851 in Oneida County, New York State in America. The farmer behind this factory was Jesse Williams, who, along with his son George, convinced the neighbours to send him their milk in return for a share of the profits of the cheese. The Williams Cheese Factory began production in May 1851. During its first season of operation, the Williams factory produced more than 100,000 pounds, 45,000 kilos of stirred curd cheddar cheese, some 5 times the amount produced by a good-sized farmstead operation of the time. The resulting savings in labour, the ability to buy supplies in bulk at lower cost, and the improved uniformity in cheese quality rendered the Williams experiment an immediate success that was soon replicated as new factories sprang up across the New York countryside. These factories weren't particularly industrial, at least not by modern standards, and it's questionable to call them factories. They still made cheese using the traditional methods, but worked at a larger scale than an individual farm could. However, the cheese they produced was more consistent than it would have been when made on individual farms, where each farm produced a slightly different cheese. These local small-scale factories spread throughout America over the next decade and began exporting their cheese overseas, particularly to Britain. At around the same time, the late 1850s, similar cheese factories were beginning to develop in other parts of the world too, such as France, where the makers of Camembert in Normandy were also scaling up their production as their market increased. However, cheesemaking in France remained very localized, so they didn't end up with a handful of factory-produced cheeses dominating the market. Today, France is still known as a country with so many different cheeses. As these early cheese factories were largely just scaled-up versions of farm cheesemaking, they still had a way to go before they start to resemble the industrial factories of today. But it didn't take long for that to start to happen. The next catalyst for the development of the cheese factory in America was the American Civil War, which began in 1861. Many of the workers in the cheese factories in the North joined the Union Army and went off to war. This meant that the factory owners had to come up with ways to still make the same amount of cheese, but with less labour, leading to technological improvements. At the same time, many of the farms stopped making cheese themselves, and instead sent their milk to the factories because the burden of running the farms fell to the women when their men joined the army. As it was often the women who were also making the cheese, it makes sense that something had to give, and in most cases it ended up being their cheese making that they had to give up in order to be able to do the rest of the work on the farm. The outbreak of the American Civil War made the English market even more attractive because English merchants paid for goods in gold currency, not American paper currency that was becoming worthless through rampant wartime inflation. Consequently, new US cheese factories sprang up overnight, and exports to England rose from £5 million, 2.3 million kilograms in 1859, to £50 million, 23 million kilograms in 1863. That is a lot of cheese. So at this point in the mid-1860s, much of the advances in scientific understanding was happening in England, while the cheese factories were taking off in America. Just after the American Civil War ended, these two finally came together thanks to Xerxes Willard, a representative of the American Dairymen's Association. Willard travelled to England in 1866 to visit dairies and look into their cheese making, to see if there was anything they were doing that the American factories could adopt. One factory that stood out to him was owned by Joseph Harding. Harding's scientific approach incorporated defined schedules for time, temperature, and acidity at various steps in the cheese-making process, which opened the door to unprecedented control over cheese quality and consistency. Willard brought Harding's scientific approach to cheddar making back to America, concluding that, "After having seen all the different styles of cheese in Great Britain, I am of the opinion that the cheddar is the only process from which American dairymen can obtain suggestions of practical utility." Willard later published all of his insights into dairying, including cheesemaking, in Willard's Practical Dairy Husbandry. One of the reasons Harding aimed to improve cheddar making was to raise the standard of English cheddar to fight off competition from overseas, but it ended up having the opposite effect as he created a system that could be easily replicated elsewhere, and pretty much all of the information about it was published in journals, so easy to access. Harding's improved technology helped the new American cheddar cheese factories attain great competitive advantage by operating at ever larger scales, thereby lowering the unit cost of production. Advancements in scientific understanding and increasing scales of cheesemaking led to more technological developments in cheese factories, steadily decreasing the reliance on traditional knowledge and doing things by hand, and more towards reliance on machines. Technology was developed that reduced the labour needed to make cheese, such as the steam boiler for heating milk and the gang press, which allowed multiple cheeses to be pressed at once. Cheese factories began getting larger, as did the equipment they housed, to process more milk and to make more cheese. The industrial cheese factory slowly came into being. Other countries picked up these advances and ran with them. Many countries like the Netherlands, Canada, Australia and New Zealand had cheese factories to supply export markets, particularly the British market, where they directly competed with American-made cheese. In Britain, the move towards industrialization was slow and only really in response to the decline of its local cheesemaking industry in favour of imported cheese, mainly cheddar. 2 American-style factories were built in Derbyshire in the early 1870s, initially managed by American experts. There was some success at the start, and factories even appeared in other counties. But before the decade was out, several of the original factories had changed to handling liquid milk or butter rather than cheese. Liquid milk became the focus of the majority of dairy farms in Britain, with the railway lines providing a quick means of transporting fresh milk to growing markets such as London. Imported cheese was often cheaper and more consistent than locally made too, driving down prices for local producers. It wasn't until the 1930s that English cheesemaking became as industrialised as that in other countries. In France, cheesemakers formed syndicates and associations to protect their regional cheeses from being undercut by larger outside producers. This focus on protecting the quality and local characteristics of their cheeses led to the protection of many French cheeses, with the appellation d'origine contrôlée restricting the use of certain cheese names to particular areas and cheesemaking techniques. French cheesemaking adopted more technological advances in the mid-20th century, which caused a decline in artisanal cheesemakers in the 1950s. So that is the history of how cheesemaking went from something that happened on each farm, through the cooperative system of small cheese factories, to huge industrial factories that can produce thousands of cheeses in a day. The Americans led the way at pretty much every step of the development, with other countries following along at their own rates. We're now at the point where the vast majority of cheese made is factory-made. But throughout all of this development, there have always been small artisanal cheesemakers continuing to make cheese using more traditional methods, and small cheese factories that try to produce more traditional styles of cheese. So, are you a fan of mass-produced factory-made cheese with its consistency and reliability? Do you prefer the variety and complexity of small-scale artisanal cheeses, or do you make your own cheese? Let me know in the comments. Personally, I tend to use mass-produced cheese for cooking and everyday use when flavour isn't as important, but prefer the complex flavours of artisanal and homemade cheese for cheese boards or just eating on crackers. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to support Cheese History, I'm on Patreon and Instagram, so feel free to check those out. You can also subscribe to the channel and click on the bell notification if you'd like to be notified when I post a new video. See you next time.